Welcome to Sabs podcast. I'm your host, sabrinasalvati. My special guest tonight is Danny Haiphong. He's an author and he's also the host of Danny Haiphong YouTube show where he discusses geopolitics. Welcome back, Danny.
Thanks so much for hosting me today, Sabby. It's good to be back on your channel.
All right. So you actually did something really big. You were recently in China. I want to hear a little bit about your trip to China. Why did you decide to go there? And I want to hear a little bit about what you feel about China politically after being there.
Sure. So I went to China in mid-April for about 10 days. I believe it was the 14th to the 24th of April. I went with the host organization was the China Network of International Exchanges, but it was in collaboration with Friends of Socialist China, which is organized by two close friends of mine who live in London, Carlos Martinez and Keith Bennett. Keith Bennett holding many connections with China over the past several decades, many decades of doing business, as well as hosting political exchanges in solidarity with the People's Republic of China, dating all the way back to the early reform and opening up period. So in any event, I went to China with a group. It was mainly folks from Ireland, the UK, and Margaret Kimberly and I were actually two of the folks from the United States. And it was Margaret's first time to China, and it was really great to be with her for that experience. And so the point of the trip, it was all centered around socialism and modernization in China, because that is the big push right now for China, for its political process and its development process. The conversation is all about a new catchterm, a new catchphrase, high quality productive forces. And the point of the trip was to essentially see these high quality productive forces in the varying cities that we visited. So we visited 3 different provinces. First, we went to the city of Beijing. Then we went to the birthplace, actually, of the Communist Party of China, the real birthplace. Essentially, the Communist Party of China was founded in Shanghai, but the French Quarter, police security, private security, kicked out the 10 or so people who were attempting to form the party. They actually took a boat to a province called Zhejiang province. That's where we went. We stayed in a place called the Red Boat Academy, which is actually a school for new Communist Party members. So we got to experience what that was like. And then we went to the province of Jilin and visited a few cities, Changchuan and Jiaxing. And actually, Jiaxing is in the Zhejiang province. But we went to a few cities in Jilin, and Jilin actually borders the DPRK and Russia. So it's a very interesting experience going there, because a lot of the economy and development is actually geared toward things that you wouldn't really expect a very small province to be geared toward. A lot of new energy development, a lot of renewable energy development happening there. Actually, the high-speed rail industry, that's a huge industry right now in China, because they're building so much high-speed rail. A lot of it comes out of Jilin, a lot of the production. And it's no surprise that that is taking place along the border with especially Russia, given all the energy trade that goes on between Russia and China. So I was there to do many things. We had meetings with various organizations like the China Center for Globalization. We also met with the provincial party school in Jilin to learn about Jilin's socialist modernization process. And essentially, we also visited agricultural cooperatives. We visited one in Lishu County, which is outside of Jilin, and learned about the various ways that China's modernization, how it has been able to move up the production value chain and bring higher quality productive forces to China, meaning that not only is there fast growth in China, but there's also quality growth that reaches not just the society in terms of GDP, but also in terms of people's living standards. And that is how China is talking about development now, especially after the eradication of absolute poverty in 2020. The conversation is not about, well, what is the economic growth target? They said it every year. Actually, I believe now China is beating expectations according to the IMF as of 2024. I believe the estimation is that China will grow 5%, but that isn't even the most important marker for China. The most important marker is China moving its productive forces away from lower value added production, away from being what it used to be, which is the kind of factory of the world for low cost products, and moving toward actually generating some of the most innovative technology, innovative productive forces that exist in the world, which then actually, ironically, brings down the cost of some of the things that we consider to be absolutely just out of reach for most people in the United States and the West. For example, like electric vehicles. Jilin, where we visited, also produces a lot of electric vehicles, a lot of new energy vehicles. There's a lot of the major Chinese car companies, state-owned, many of them, car companies in Jilin. And we just learned, as of 2023, China became the biggest car producer by far in the world, and also the biggest producer of electric vehicles, new energy vehicles, all across the board. And now there's been an announcement just after I got back from China that one of the companies in China, called BYD, the biggest producer of new energy vehicles, is about to unleash a hybrid vehicle that can travel 2,000 kilometers on a single charge, the distance from New York to Miami. And it's going to change just everything about the new energy vehicle industry, because it's going to cost 100,000 RMB. Divide that by 7, and you have a very, very, very cheap electric vehicle on hand, new, purchased new. So that's going to change a lot of things. And this is why the United States is so worried about China, because it is moving into these high-tech industries that are so important to the future of humanity. If we're going to truly live in egalitarian, if we're going to truly live in a world where people have access to everything that they need, this kind of technology has to be distributed much more fairly. And China is building up the forces that allows that to happen. So that was mainly the basis of the trip. In terms of what I learned politically about China, it was really an affirmation of what I already knew. So China at this moment is, of course, subject to so much anti-China propaganda coming out of the United States, mainly, but even the entire collective West. And what they say about China is usually just flat out untrue. The biggest issue that the United States likes to finger wag to China about politically is that the Communist Party of China is repressive, that it doesn't allow people to have a say in how they live their lives,
Right.
that people are brainwashed. They're just essentially following whatever the party says because they are scared. Well, if you ever go to China and you actually have your eyes open, you don't come in there with an agenda like some of these anti-China weirdos on YouTube, like Lao Wai, and these, just absolute losers from, these South African apartheid colonials. Like, if you're not like these people coming in, just doctoring footage and spreading lies, and you actually just keep your eyes open and just walk around, talk to people, you will get no sense that there is fear in China. Actually, the level of confidence that Chinese people have in their overall trajectory as a civilization is what they call it now. That is the new kind of way of looking at China as a whole, that the nation state model doesn't really conform to how China is constructed as a society, because it has so many different ethnic groups, 56 ethnic groups, and has this ancient history. So there's a lot of harkening back to China as a civilization in a modern sense right now. So there is no kind of fear about China and its leadership. Actually, most of the time when I go there, questions about my leadership, about the US's leadership, comes up. The big one, the last 2 times I've been to China, so I was there in July 2023 and then now April 2024. The big question I'm always asked is, how do the American people, how do Americans tolerate having options like Joe Biden and Donald Trump? How could this be allowed to happen? Because if these two so-called leaders were trying to enter the political process in China, they would not be able to even hold a position at the very lowest level, township or village level. They would be completely they would be completely fired from their position. They would not have a position, because the main measurement of politics in China, the main measurement how good of a leader is what have they done for people, what have they done for China. It's not what have they done for rich people, what have they done for private industry, what have they done for banks or anything like that. It's what, in whatever capacity you're in as an official, what have you done for China and the Chinese people. And so when I was there, that's a sense that you got. And being around, when I was staying at the party school in Zhejiang, when I was at the party school where we went to lectures at Jilin University, at Jilin's provincial school. We also went to Jilin University as well. I actually met a fan there. So if you think that people are not watching in the world for what we do, people are definitely watching. People in China are definitely watching. I met another person from Malaysia who watches my show. I'm sure she probably has come across your show, Sabby. People are watching because there's a lot of, whenever I go to China, a lot of curiosity in, how is it that these are the narratives, that these are the politics that dominate in the United States, that this is the economic order that's allowed to dominate? And how is it that there's going to be change? Like, who's going to do that? How is that going to happen? There's a lot of curiosity about where things really need to change, because when I go to China, people are looking forward. They have criticisms, they have desires, they have opinions, but at the same time, the confidence in the overall trajectory in China is just at an all-time high, even despite the so-called economic slowdown that we always hear about that China supposedly has. We're supposed to believe that because the property sector is not booming in China anymore, that means that China's economy is falling apart. But what we learned, and what, if you even just read Chinese English language media, if you read government work reports that come out of China, it's not different. You go to China, you're like, okay, well, I'm going to see something completely different from what I read in English language media. Actually, not. That's the level of congruence between those things is actually pretty high. And so, going there, the talk is not about, whether the property sector can be propped up, and how do we keep what was going well maybe 20, 30 years ago going. No, China is looking to transition. It's not looking to collapse anything. It's looking to transition into a new phase of development, because what worked in the past, just absolutely pouring everything into what the global economy viewed at the time as what was needed for investment. That's no longer the case. The United States, if we want to look at properties, we want to look at property, services, these kind of things, kind of low value added goods. These things are a thing of the past. The where those things are produced are in countries that are super exploited. That the most of the global stuff that produces some of the cheapest goods that aren't really what we would consider innovative. Toys and clothing, things like this. Those are a thing of the past. These things are they've so overloaded the market that any country that puts all of its eggs in those baskets are going to be incredibly impoverished. Even look at India. India is supposedly growing 7-9% per year, supposedly. But why are people, I'm sorry to say, why are people going to the bathroom in the streets? It's because that country has not been able to not only distribute wealth in a more egalitarian and a more equal fashion, in a way that is people-centered, but also the productive forces are so uneven in India. There's such a huge investment in services, right? So like the call center of the world kind of thing. Like it's all services, while China is looking at, well, here are the things that the world needs to produce. It needs to kind of produce fast, like new energy vehicles, modern infrastructure, high technology that can connect people everywhere. Like these are the things of the future, and that's where China is going. That's what I saw, right? There's this interesting interplay between history. There's a lot of going back to history. Chinese people know their history. They have the ability to learn their history everywhere you go in China, right? So I was in Zhejiang. I was in the province where the Communist Party of China was founded, and there's memorials everywhere. I went to a little city called Seping, and that was where some of the bloodiest fights during the so-called Civil War, the war to liberate China, not just from Japan, but then from the nationalist forces that were collaborating with Japan and then the United States. I was able to go to a memorial and a museum about that city and what it represented. And it's things that you don't get to experience in the United States more generally, because although the United States has a rich history of resistance, and certainly you can learn that history, resistance to slavery, resistance to exploitation, it does not have a rich history in terms of, unfortunately, winning power. And that's something that you get a lot of when you go to China, and it's being emphasized a lot more. And I think that the impetus to expose people from outside of China, especially in the collective West too, that is going to grow because of all of the misunderstanding that has been so deeply embedded in the consciousness of people in the collective West, in the United States in particular, about China, that this history, this struggle that Chinese people have had to wage, coming from literally the bottom, literally the worst of the worst conditions that have ever existed for humanity at an economic level. And of course, if we count these wars, from the Opium Wars to the War of Japanese Aggression to the Chinese so-called Civil War, all of this was incredibly bloody, incredibly damaging, incredibly difficult and challenging. And it led to really difficult periods even after the revolution that that people still remember to this day. So China is in a very interesting place because it has incredible amounts of popular support. It has a large, confident population in where China is going. There is a lot of talk, actually, when I'm in China too, and this will be interesting probably to your viewers as well, that I don't know if you saw the video of Vladimir Putin saying that Joe Biden is predictable, so he would prefer Joe Biden. I don't know if you were able to show that to your viewers at some point. But actually in China, it's funny. A lot of people view Donald Trump as a great uniter of China. So China is a very politically diverse place. It comes from a class. It comes from a very difficult and challenging kind of class system that existed before the revolution. And this, of course, you don't just get rid of everything. So you do have, just like anywhere else that has ever had a revolution, you'll have people who are much more pro-Western and much more pro-America, right? And they want to leave and they want to, cause trouble abroad, or they want to cause trouble inside China. It's a lot, but it's a lot less than it's ever been. And a lot of people try to credit that to the way that Donald Trump spoke about China, especially during COVID and afterward. And a lot of people see that trajectory politically of the United States as, while being incredibly dangerous, and certainly nobody in China really wants a war with the United States, they also see how the United States' political posture towards China has in many ways benefited China. The political leadership will always take the line of cooperation and a stable world order and rejecting bloc confrontation and these kind of things. But a lot of people in China, and I'm sure this exists at a higher level too, believe that what the United States is doing, just like what's happening with Russia, is benefiting China greatly. And China is becoming much more self-reliant than we've seen over the past several decades. Then it's becoming more self-reliant than it's ever been. And it's at the perfect time to become more self-reliant, because China has been able to build up its productive forces, its status in the world. It's been able to take a lead in a way that is just unprecedented for a country with its history, and that is not subject to change. And that is this feeling that you get. You go to a country that at one point 75 years ago was one of the poorest in the world. You go there now, and you see people with this enormous confidence. Nobody walks with their heads down. That's why a lot of people were laughing at Janet Yellen when I was there in July. She she came to Beijing right after I left, and she had this scene where she bowed to Xi Jinping, and a lot of people I was with in China were like, "We don't do that in China. We just don't bow. We don't bow. Like, that's not Japan. Like, go to Japan. Like, can she not tell the difference? Like, that's what I was.
They think all Asian countries are the same.
Yes, yes, yes. A long-standing history of racism there, but nonetheless, that was my experience in China, and it was an incredible one. And I'm actually going back this summer, so I look forward to that.
Awesome. Well, I know you mentioned the living standards, and that was one of the questions I wanted to talk to you about because I actually read a while back that China has almost eradicated homelessness. And I just want to hear from you based on your experience. Did you see many homeless people there on the streets? The way that we have it in the United States. And then also, this is a really good point here by Jacqueline. How is China when it comes to energy saving housing? That's another question I'm curious about, just the housing situation overall. So, for example, like when you were in like Beijing, did you see like homeless people the way that you do in New York City or even here in Boston? What was that like?
No, this would be my third time in Beijing this past April, and no, and never will you see. This is especially in the bigger cities, but even in the smaller cities that I was in this time around. In the cities, you will not see it. Now, people in China will talk about homelessness, but it's a different kind of homelessness. So, essentially, China's economy has grown out of what was once basically a majority countryside, a majority peasantry, a majority rural agricultural system. And the urbanization, the influx of the so-called market, the rapid development of industry, that led to uneven development, that led to imbalances. And so the homelessness at any point in China's history, including today, is from that uneven development. It's from people migrating to the cities, looking for work, potentially maybe not able to find that work, or just needing time to find that work kind of thing, and not having necessarily a place to stay of their own. But China over the last several years has built a much more robust welfare system. That was one of the criticisms, especially in the 90s and early 2000s of China, was that it was neglecting that part of it. But now the party, especially with the calls for common prosperity, especially with the calls to not just eradicate absolute poverty, but to address relative poverty, that's the next step in China's anti-poverty process. There, you will not find people sleeping outside in the streets because there is a concerted effort to ensure that people have somewhere to be, whether it is in the social services system, or whether it is, and this is the key thing to know about China, is that whenever people come from, it's just a different society. And it's a socialist country, so this also has to do a lot with the way that socialism really started in the countryside for China, because that was where the liberation war was won. That was where the majority of people came from. That was the majority of the Red Army, the People's Liberation Army. And so a lot of people, actually, what happens is that they have a place to be. They have a family. They have a home. It might be in the countryside, and of course, there's still a lot of ways to go before the countryside is at the development level of the cities. That is the hope, is that there is no difference between town and countryside. It's basically the hope of all socialist countries ever, because they've all happened in places where there is this large agrarian, large peasantry almost entirely. I mean, I think the Soviet Union, you could say, was an exception, but they still had a pretty large agrarian sector, a pretty large rural society. But nonetheless, people have a place to go. So it's different in the sense from, let's say, in the United States, where, I mean, we could just talk about all the different examples of how homelessness occurs. Homelessness occurs in the United States mainly because people don't have money. And even if people have not a lot of money in China, generally they will have somewhere to go back into the countryside where their family is that will take care of them until they can figure it out. And so China's big, I would say, mission is to, one, conduct what they call rural revitalization, essentially lift the standard of living of all people in the rural areas in China to a degree where the cities don't have to be don't have to be the site of this massive migration. And then in the cities, work on the welfare system, work on these this uneven development, these imbalances that happen, like the residential system in China called the Hoku system. There's imbalances there. A lot of people move there. Not everyone can live in the cities. But nonetheless, all of this is to say is that because there is a concerted effort to address these not easy problems, these are not easy things to address. Nonetheless, you will not find people sleeping rough, as they say in the United Kingdom. You won't find people doing that in China because there's so many different mechanisms in place, and people kind of care, right? Like they're like the party cares, the government, it cares about what happens to people. And it doesn't mean that life is always easy. It doesn't mean that everyone has the same exact opportunities, because that is just a very difficult thing to achieve until there is this point where wealth can essentially be distributed equally. Hard to do in a global system that we live under, but there is a very conservative. So no, you will not find the kind of home. You will not find the tent cities like you'll find in Oakland. You won't
Right.
find. You will find nothing like Skid Row. Nothing like that. That would be if there was a Skid Row in any part of China, the entire local government there would be deposed. It would be a massive scandal. It would be the central government would come in and this is the relationship of kind of the political process in China. If local governments are not doing what they're supposed to be doing, if there's corruption or whatever, you better believe the central government will find out about it and they will be taken care of. It happened during COVID. The early detection system in China for things like viruses and pandemics was seen to be just not up to par, even though it seemed to be I think it was like floating around. Nobody knew it was happening for like a day, couple days to a week. But even that was like, no, the entire local government administration in Wuhan was just deposed because there's a high standard set on things like, protecting people's interests. And a lot of the anti-corruption campaign has centered on local governments, because that's been historically the case, even throughout the early period, the period that a lot of leftists like to romanticize. It's been the case since the beginning that it's just a lot harder at the local level to maintain the kind of oversight, to maintain the kind of symbiotic relationship with a broader, bigger party. How do you manage local conditions versus the conditions of the entire country? This is all hard stuff that I have no idea about, because I live in the United States and I'm completely alienated from my political process. I feel like I have no say, and I know that a lot of your viewers feel the same. If we want universal health care, we just have no process to put forward that demand and have it actually be listened to and met, unless we take pitchforks and start storming Washington. That's really the only thing that will get any level of official really listening to us. So yeah, I mean, homelessness in China, it does exist, because you could say that there are people who don't have like permanent homes that they could go. They might not
Right.
want to go to the countryside. Maybe they don't want to be with their family. Maybe something happened with their family. There's social issues, social concerns. Maybe they can't find work. Maybe they have psychological difficulties, issues. There are mental health, just like anywhere in the world. There's mental health problems. There's things like that occur. But it's a very small population, and it's one that you won't find sleeping rough, because it's not allowed. They're not being thrown in prison, but they're being
Right.
approached. There's a concerted effort and it's just a different society. It's more of a collective society. It's not viewed as almost allowable to just allow people to suffer when someone is just right in front of you suffering. That's just not seen as okay. So in any event, that's my impression of China, is that homelessness is such a small problem. That's why most people say it's basically not a problem. And home ownership in China is very high. A big reason for
Yeah.
that is because not only are banks mainly state owned in China, so it's very hard to you're not going to get like Sally Mae, or for the student loans, you're not going to get you know, a Wells Fargo seeking out so-called quote unquote mud people to, sell predatory loans to, because most of the banks are state owned. I think over 80% of them, and the big ones that really matter, 100%. So people get favorable mortgages, where, zero to low interest. And even if their jobs may not be able to pay for high property values in the big cities. Generally, this is a thing in China. People are very good at saving money. So you might have family kind of like dowry endowment kind of thing. And so it's
Mhm.
essentially, that's why home ownership in China is about 80 to 90%. And depending on what statistic you look at, and that's a very high percentage. It's even for younger people. Even for younger people, this
Yeah.
is the case, despite the fact that everyone in China will tell you that Beijing, Shanghai, these places are very expensive. That is surely a big problem that is being addressed as we speak. It's actually why CNN and these places can't stop talking about the property sector, because prices are falling mainly because China is letting that happen. They don't really want to see, million, $2 million, $4 million homes, US dollar homes, just be unoccupied, and it essentially just sit there wasting away.
And to give people a perspective, some of my students were from China. Like when I was a part of the grad programs, some of my students were from China, and most of them did not want to try to obtain a work visa to stay in the United States. Most of them told me that they wanted to go back home to China. And when I would ask why, I'm like, you don't want to stay here? And they would say, well, it's not that I don't like it here. It's just that back home, I actually have the opportunity to buy a home. Whereas here in the United States, it's so expensive. And, there's other things that go along with that, with the whole work visa situation. And a company has to want to sponsor you. It's a whole mess of what you have to go through. But they were telling me that like, even then that millennials, more millennials own their homes in China than obviously here in the United States. And it's really astounding. I'm curious, did you see any type of, because this has been a big push here in the United States, particularly on the East Coast and the West Coast, did you see any type of solar panels on top of any of the homes or anything like that? Any type of push towards energy conservation?
Oh, I mean, China is by far the world leader in new energy consumption and of course production by far. You go to any city in China, even in the Lishu County Agricultural Cooperative, this is a very rural area we were in, where we're talking about just farmland. It grew corn, it grew other staple crops, and it had it was a lot of its facilities were solar powered. A lot of its facilities were wind powered. So electric vehicles, electric tractors, those kind of things. Now China, it's everywhere in China. I mean, you go to China, there's a very interesting person who works for the Green Belt and Road Institute, Eric Solheim. And I remember he posted on his Twitter about him running in Beijing, just on the street and being like, man, when I was here 20, 30 years ago, I could not do that because of how polluted it was. But now you can do it. And why is that? Well, it's because China literally has 100% of the consumption market of electric buses in China. So China has 100% of the world. Not nowhere else in the world is there even a fraction of the uses of things like electric buses like in China. New energy vehicles in terms of cars. That's a booming industry. That is one that is growing astronomically. And of course, the transit system, the rapid growth of the transit system over the last 2 to 3 decades has been just, there's no other country you could point to and say, well, yep, they're competing with China in these areas. So new energy is everywhere. I mean, now, actually, this was a new thing. I didn't see this. Did I see this? I don't know if I saw this in July or I had 2023 and didn't notice, but I definitely did not see it when I was there in 2020. But now when you buy a new energy vehicle, there are green license plates that you are provided. So you can tell just by your eye. You don't have to look, hey, does it have a muffler or whatever? Is it a hybrid vehicle or a completely new energy vehicle? No, you'll see through the green license plate that it is a new energy vehicle. So all this is to say is, yes, solar panels are everywhere on the building, on the residences. When I first went to China in 2020, that was what struck out the most to me, was how unlike in the United States, where you drive on the West Side Highway in New York, and you look at that one solar panel powering the traffic light system for the highway, and you're like, that's all that there is here in terms of solar energy. In China, it's everywhere. And you might ask, well, how are they able to do that? Because maybe some people have experiences of trying to make their homes solar energy, to use solar energy, and how costly it is. It's like incredibly costly to do that in the United States. Well, just so happens that China produces the parts to this stuff. So China, the polysilicon that's needed to power solar energy, it is the home of that key resource. And the United States actually has leveled sanctions under Joe Biden on that very needed natural resource that goes into these solar panels. And of course, we know the longstanding history of the fossil fuel monopolies not allowing for new energy production to happen at any level in the United States that is comparable to China. So by producing so much of it, China has actually lowered the cost of the ability where it has. See, this is just like economy 101, right? If you produce a lot of something, it's not going to be worth as much. But if it's not worth as much, then you can buy it and you can use it, and it can be used by many people. When I was in China, I met up with someone from Beijing Review, and he picked me up in I believe he has a BYD. No, he doesn't have a BYD. He has some, I forget the name of it. There's so many electric vehicle producers in China, but he was talking to me about his purchasing process of it, because I asked him, I was like, what did this thing cost you? And he said, well, it's 2018 model. It's not necessarily new, but I bought it new. And he said, well, I probably purchased it for around I think he said something like 70,000 RMB or something like that. So that would be equivalent to around 9 to 10,000 US dollars. So while many would say, well, that's kind of expensive, if you look at any new energy vehicle on the market in the United States used, you're going to be paying 3 times more than that. So that's the difference, right? You can get a used vehicle from Tesla or from whatever. I know there's a lot of these other big monopolies in the auto industry are producing them at such a minuscule rate. But let's say you go Tesla, Chrysler, whatever, you're probably paying $30,000 for a used model of the same year. I did some research on this because I was so curious. And yeah, he bought it for about 9 to 10,000 US dollars, and it was completely new. And it's a Chinese model. And he said, it's safer. There's more kind of controls around it, regulations in China around things like safety in electric vehicles. And there's charging stations everywhere. So when I talked to him about the problems with charging stations, let's say you get an electric vehicle in the United States, good luck trying to charge that thing. He said that's an absolutely ridiculous problem, because in China there are charging stations everywhere. They kind of almost model the gas stations that we are so familiar with here in the US.
Interesting. I want to move into Russia and this idea of a multipolar world. So I'm not sure if you've seen this yet, Danny, but this is kind of like snuck by because there's been so much attention on Trump's trial that I think a lot of people may not have seen this just yet. But the Biden administration has actually given the green light for Ukraine to strike inside of Russia. I want to play this clip here for just a second.
Weapons inside Russia. How do you feel about that?
I think that's the right decision. I think, Ukraine needs to get whatever help it can get in defending itself. And I think NATO has urged that we allow those strikes. France, Germany, Great Britain, Canada, Finland, most of our allies have urged that. I think it is important for the United States to provide a unified approach that allows the Ukrainians to strike at those targets.
I don't know where this Ukraine war goes. You always hear, Secretary, that right now Russia is back having the full advantage here.
Yeah, and so he's obviously very nervous there at the end towards the end of that conversation. But where does this leave BRICS? I mean, giving Ukraine permission to strike inside of Russia, which is obviously very dangerous. Do you Do you foresee any of the other countries that are a part of BRICS to publicly speak out against this? Of course, I think China may have something to say as they've spoken out against Israel as well. But I'm talking about some of the other countries like South Africa and India and Brazil. Are any of them going to speak up and push back against this, and why or why not?
Well, BRICS is at this moment still a very evolving process. The countries within BRICS have a lot of political diversity, and the main impetus for BRICS right now is to focus on the economic connectivity of these countries and how to build a kind of new financial architecture that will lead to more financial sovereignty in the form not just of currency, although the currency question gets the most attention, but in terms of all mechanisms of finance and development. So in terms of this, I think this is where the big question lies on this very issue that asking Leon Panetta is a very interesting exchange here for Fox News, given that Leon Panetta has so much experience, not just in the CIA in his early career, but also as one of Obama's defense chiefs. This is a really interesting question. If and should, and it will happen, U.S. weapons are found to have struck they call it old Russian territory. So Ukraine has already been hitting Belgorod and has already been, striking across the border. The CIA has known this because the CIA is everywhere in Ukraine. Of course, the United States and NATO have known this. And of course, Ukraine really doesn't do anything without the United States' at least awareness. We can't necessarily say they do everything the United States essentially wants, because we see how Zelensky talks. We see how absolutely out of control the Ukrainian regime has become in many respects. But we know that the United States is aware and also has a logistical personnel, and NATO has logistical personnel on the ground to be influential. And so should these weapons on this now official capacity, this is almost the equivalent, right, of Joe Biden and some of these other NATO countries that have also approved this, striking Russian soil with these weapons. Instead of saying, well, Ukraine has the weapons, it's doing what it thinks is right, and we don't give it formal approval to do that. We actually reject that. That was the U.S.'s position for a very long time up until this point. This is almost the equivalent of what Nikki Haley did with those missiles in Israel, right? Like finished them on it. It's almost as if Joe Biden is writing his name on, the ATACMS missiles and things like that will be supposedly used to hit Russian territory now. And with that, it brings a whole different kind of political calculus to the conflict, because what Russia has said is, well, if you were distancing yourself from it, if you said this wasn't approved, then it's plausible to say, well, okay, Ukraine is doing this on their own volition, and mainly they're hitting civilian targets, and so we can kind of justify that as it's wrong. We're going to make Ukraine pay for hitting civilians, and it's awful, but this is a kind of Ukraine-Russia issue. Now it is not that. Now it is the United States giving a green light, and the United States has to, by way of force, if Ukraine is going to use any of these weapons, this has been the case since the very beginning, it has to receive training and has to receive, in some cases, actual commands from U.S. U.S. personnel. This would definitely be the case if it came to like F-16s. That's always talked about, F-16s Ukraine, F-16s Ukraine. If F-16s in Ukraine were to use their weapons to strike Russia, essentially that would be viewed as the United States giving orders to strike Russia, and that means the United States is hitting Russia. So if that were the case, then Russia is going to step up on the escalation ladder and say, well, U.S. weapons, U.S. personnel are facilitating Ukrainian attacks. The U.S. is waging war on us. We have the rights by the laws of war, international law, etc., to now hit U.S. assets. So that is where this inevitably goes, and this includes the NATO countries, the UK and others that have approved this process. That's where this conflict inevitably goes, and that top of that escalation ladder ends up being nuclear war, and that can happen actually very quickly should this bear fruit, should these developments bear fruit. And it's not impossible. I'm not saying it's highly likely. I believe Russia has shown restraint, maybe to the point where the United States and NATO view Russia as politically weak, not militarily weak, but politically weak, in the sense that it believes Russia just won't call the bluff of the United States, won't respond in kind to its provocations. But if any of that should happen, then indeed, I don't think there would be a BRICS country that would approve that. Now, how vocal each one of them will be, will they be unified? Will they be vocal as a bloc? That would be an interesting question for the BRICS summit in October, depending on how fast some of these developments go, because they're going to meet in Kazan, which is in Russia. They're going to most likely admit several new members. They're going to build on this momentum of adding 6 more members. Of course, Argentina dropped out, so essentially adding 5 new members to BRICS, and they're going to try to add more and build on the progress of that financial architecture I spoke about. But should these developments and things in Ukraine, this conflict, are moving very, 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 very fast. Russia's progress on the battlefield, while it may not look humongous, the initiative is certainly all with Russia. The United States and NATO knows this. They know that there is no so-called silver bullet, as they constantly say, to change the dynamics there. The United States is hoping, I think, and I believe, in all of NATO, I think, is hoping that by going up its own escalation ladder with Russia, it can make Russia back down and give Ukraine the opportunity to become what a lot of us have feared from the very beginning here, which has become a site of a forever war, of a war that just doesn't end, that its kinetic element, its military element does not end. There's no ceasing or ceasefire or peace agreement or anything like that occurs, that there's just a constant and steady state of kinetic warfare, so that we all know the United States and NATO, the military contractors, they see this as very profitable. But it also gives them time, if they can turn this into a war of attrition that doesn't end, because the fear now is that the war of attrition is going to end on Russia's behalf and in Russia's favor, and that there will be a finite conclusion. Ukraine will eventually be crushed and will have to negotiate on terms that are favorable to Russia. That means the U.S. and NATO will have to be involved in some kind of negotiations process to just save Ukraine from being totally wiped out in terms of its current political and military trajectory and status. And that is just an anathema right now to the U.S. foreign policy establishment, to the elite, to the blob, and of course to the monopolies and the big capital and these forces that truly do have in their minds a scenario that sees a war with Russia as not just a positive development, but an absolutely necessary one should the United States remain on top in the world order. So BRICS certainly will respond individually. I don't know if at this point it will respond as an entity, as one. Of course, there is not a single country, especially in the founding members of BRICS, that sees this conflict as anything but a proxy war on Russia. That has been confirmed by the way India and even South Africa have behaved in relation to it, not following, for example, South Africa was very vocal about not following the ICC arrest warrant for Putin, was very vocal against it. Then there was, of course, the sanctions that India would not follow, despite the fact that India has, as one of its huge goals, is to integrate more and more and more into the United States' kind of economic orbit. It views that as very important to its development to counter China. But then when it saw that it would have to be completely cut off from Russia's massive energy reserves that are needed to fuel industry, India said, absolutely not. We are not going to go down that path. We are not going to self-destruct. And so India has not followed the sanctions on Russia. So all this is to say is that, you won't find, even amongst those countries that we might typically see as more vulnerable, South Africa, India, to the West's political whims, I don't think we're going to find them following them. And of course, Brazil, at this moment, Brazil is still finding its way in trying to stabilize a very difficult situation. But you're never going to see Lula da Silva put a rubber stamp on a proxy war against Russia, especially given how important both Russia and China are to Brazil's economic future. So all in all, BRICS, we're not going to see a unified message, but there's not going to be any appetite should this escalation ladder be set off because of this move. There's not going to be any appetite to jump on the United States' bandwagon, to jump on NATO's bandwagon, and oppose Russia. There's going to be a lot of fear and worry that what the United States has just done will actually be a tripwire for what could be a cataclysmic global conflict, which would essentially eviscerate all of the goals that BRICS has, because an unstable world order that is characterized by World War III would make BRICS essentially irrelevant. It would not be relevant anymore, because there is this humanity threatening war, which would be nuclear. So Russia and China are really the big, they are what the United States would view as the head of the monster. They are the leaders of the multipolar world. They are the leaders of BRICS. Any multilateral organization that you would consider to be a multipolar one, Shanghai Cooperation Organization, any of these institutions are viewed as Russia and China being in the lead of them. And with that, you're not going to see any appetite to isolate Russia or to rubber stamp anything that the United States does in this regard. And it really is a reckless move. It's something that's kind of going down quietly, because I do think the United States is viewing this as a bluff. They know Ukraine has been hitting Russian territory. They haven't rubber stamped it or approved it. They approved it with Crimea. They've said, oh, okay, well, Russia's occupying Crimea supposedly. And it's, and sometimes it'll waffle. Blinken will say one thing one day and another thing the next about Crimea. But all in all, the United States has been showing and exposing what has been clear for quite a while with this conflict, was that it's doing damage control. It's trying to find a way to not lose. It's trying to find a way for Ukraine to not lose. And right now, you'll see it in all of the papers, all of the media. The main narrative is, well, how do we allow Ukraine to survive in a defensive posture? It's already won so much by standing up to Russia. This is not what was being said in 2022, 2023 counteroffensive. All the narrative was, oh, well, this is it. Russia's going to fall. Okay, the sanctions will finally work and the military situation will change and Ukraine will take initiative and Ukraine will kick out Russia and it will take all of Donbass back and all the territory will go back to 1991 borders. And we won, right? We won. We struck a historic, decisive victory against Russia. People of Russia will be so fed up with Putin. They'll overthrow Putin. And now we have a balkanized, divided Russia tearing itself apart, and we'll be able to control Eurasia and then get to the real kit and caboodle of China. Like that's kind of the logic that's been in the head of the foreign policy establishment for so long now with regard to this conflict, but none of it has worked out. And this, I do believe, they believe this is kind of a posture that won't lead to anything in terms of escalating the conflict, because I don't think Joe Biden wants to see this escalation ladder step up right before the November election. But Russia is saying that it could very well do this should this move bear any concrete fruit. And I guess we will just have to see. But the multipolar world, this will only accelerate the multipolar world if any of this happens, regardless of whether BRICS can be unified on this or not, because the world is watching. The vast majority of the world is against what is happening. We've seen how the African continent, we've seen how sovereign countries in West Asia, we've seen how even countries that the United States thinks are in its orbit are not listening to sanctions on Russia. They don't want to isolate themselves from Russia. And they're also seeing how they could be next. Even if countries like Saudi Arabia are not going along with the program when it comes to Russia policy, despite the fact it has this deep relationship with the United States, well, then that policy, that Russia policy, is a failure. Because if you can't get a country that you believe, and the United States does believe this, that you believe needs you for its for defense, military armaments, needs your procurements to survive, so it doesn't get overthrown, its monarchy doesn't get overthrown, and needs you economically because essentially you almost created that government, and it was supposed to be your kind of Arab playground that protects everything in that region for you. If that country is now moving away, right, normalizing with Iran and saying we will absolutely not cut off ties with Russia, well, that policy is a failure. And that is really where this war has been lost absolutely dramatically, and already lost, regardless of whether it's fighting in Ukraine or any of that. The war has been lost completely on the global stage because it's the United States that has come out of this looking weaker, more isolated, far fewer friends. If it had any friends, I mean, the United States doesn't really have friends. The United States doesn't treat anyone like friends. But nonetheless, even countries that were supposed to be under their thumb, under the US's thumb, are no longer viewing themselves as that. And so that is the big alarm bell, I believe, when it comes to a multipolar world for the United States, is that no matter what they do here, if they pull back, the multipolar world accelerates. If they accelerate their provocations and aggression in places like Ukraine, it accelerates all the more. And that's because this is a development that really doesn't have any brakes right now, because the United States can't offer anything different that can or will supplant it.
Very good points. I have one more question for you, Danny. And this is in reference to countries unifying against the state of Israel. Loki actually posted this earlier. The Israeli ambassador to Panama, Itai Bardov, was forced to flee from protesters today. I want to show everyone this. This is quite a scene. So that was Panama, and they were pushing out the Israeli ambassador. And I say kudos to them. What do you think about the countries that are choosing to step up and criticize Israel? We've now seen that was Panama, but we've also seen that Mexico has applied for a declaration with the ICC against Israel. Other countries that are actually part of the West have starting to criticize Israel, France being one of them, Norway, etc. What do you feel about that when it comes to Israel's attack on Gaza and the genocide that's happening in Gaza? Do you feel that there is finally some type of break among the Western allies with their alignment with the United States government when it comes to Israel?
Well, it's certainly developing in that way. Of course, it can be easier to take these stances when something as untenable, as horrific, as absolutely implausible, as something that's so, global public opinion on this is just so on the side of the Palestinian cause that to take a position otherwise, like if Norway and some of these other countries took a position otherwise, these governments would be completely in contradiction to the vast majority of public opinion in their countries. It would be virtually suicidal. And so the fact that this has become such a global issue, the fact that this is affecting domestic politics in these countries, I think is incredibly significant, because it means that is ultimately the trajectory that we're going, and we're going in the trajectory of Israel becoming the isolated and pariah state that it always should have been in truth, but is now becoming because of the atrocities, because of the genocide that it is committing. The United States, of course, is going to continue on its path to prop up the the Zionist regime as much as it can, because it just cannot let go of the strategic importance that it has always laid upon Israel since, or arguably going back to the end of the 67 war, seeing Israel as just such a valuable asset to its strategic imperatives and its dominance in West Asia. But this is just going to have so many consequences, because this is something I say a lot now that doesn't get much traction in the United States and the collective West, because there is so much rightful focus on all the horrific things that are happening to Palestinians. And we should, of course, continue to ensure that people are aware of those horrible crimes, those war crimes, these genocidal crimes being committed. However, it is also true that these crimes are not a reflection of victory. They are not a reflection of dominance. They are not a reflection of strength. In fact, Israel is probably at its weakest point as a state that it has been in, maybe perhaps in its entire history, dating back to, of course, its blood-soaked founding in the 1947-48 period. So this is a very perilous time, actually, for Israel, because there's so many fronts now where it is finding itself, and the U.S., of course, right behind it, are finding themselves confronted with potentially historic defeats. So, of course, we can just look at Gaza itself. No matter what Israel does, it can continue to bomb Rafah, which it will. It will continue to target civilian areas, to destroy refugee camps and hospitals, etc. It's going to continue to do that. It's going to continue to impose the harshest suffering on the people of Palestine and the people living in Gaza. However, the resistance is still fighting in a very fierce way up and down the Gaza Strip. Just when we always hear, oh, well, Rafah, that's it, this is the last stage. No, absolutely not. They're fighting everywhere, in the north, in the center, whatever you want to say. I actually loathe the geographic kind of descriptions of Gaza, because it's such a tight little strip of land that was already unlivable before this genocide started. But nonetheless, the Palestinian resistance is fighting, with the Al-Qassam, Palestine Jihad, and the various other groups that have military wings. They are fighting, and they are fighting very hard, and it's not going to stop. There is going to be until Israel stops. That is not stopping, and it won't be defeated. We've seen, how many months do we need of evidence that Israel has absolutely no answer for just this? This is just one small front, although it gets all the attention, rightfully so, because it is where all the civilian casualties, all the Palestinians are being killed. Now, then we look at the global front. If we just look at regionally, the axis of resistance is also waging a very fierce opposition to what Israel is doing. Yemen just struck the USS Eisenhower. They're taking down MQ-9 Reaper drones from the US all the time. They've essentially blockaded the Red Sea and damaged Israel's economy, damaged the world economy, to the point where the United States and the UK feel like they need to wage a continuous military operation to stop. And it's not stopping, and they're not going to stop it, because a Saudi-led US-sponsored genocide didn't stop Ansar Allah. It actually ensured that their popular support and their resolve and ability to fight back was that much more strong, was that much stronger. And this is where there's this very difficult and sometimes hard to digest, especially for those of us in the collective West in the United States that look at it from the outside. It's hard to digest the massive amount of human suffering that comes out of this with the massive amount of resistance that comes out of it. And I think that is something that's very important to note, because whether it's Ansar Allah, whether it's Iran's Operation True Promise, which did establish a deterrence again in the region and made Israel think not once, twice. It's going to make Israel think forever about whether it wants to provoke a larger war. It strikes on Syria, although it continues to strike Syria. Have actually decreased dramatically. It used to be every other day. Now it's every once in a while. It's because Israel is now afraid of what Iran can do. Iran just demonstrated a small piece of its military capacity to Israel and the United States, foreshadowed it, communicated with the United States about it because it didn't want a broader war, but it did want to show both Israel and the United States what it can do at a very small fraction, at a very small level of what might happen if a broader war were to break out. And that has had actually a major effect. That's why we're not really talking about Iran and Israel, whether they're going to be at war anymore. It's because Iran launched a very successful military operation. People in the West say, oh, no, it's not successful. They didn't hit anything important. That wasn't even the point. They didn't really care if they hit anything. I believe that they did hit some important military installations in Israel, but that wasn't the point. The point was to show off what would happen, to show that there's this fraction of a capacity that they have, drones, missile strikes that they can launch at a very rapid, very fast, at a very fast rate, and they did it. And now the situation has changed dramatically. So you have that. You have Hezbollah in the north along Lebanon's southern border into so-called the north of Israel, which most people in the region would not call Israel, but at the north of Palestine, so to speak, there is fierce fighting, and Israel will not escalate with Hezbollah. They're very afraid. Gallant talks out of the side of his mouth saying he's going to wage war. He wants to wage war with Lebanon. They need to move up the escalation ladder with Hezbollah. It's not going to happen because the U.S. would never approve it, and Israel understands, even if they're not smart enough or just so war hungry and rabid to get it through their thick genocidal skulls, that if they did that, Hezbollah would rain down. I think they could rain down something like 1,000 missiles upon Tel Aviv in a matter of a few minutes or something. Like, it would be absolutely disastrous. The resistance is incredibly strong. Iraq, Syria have a very strong pro-Palestine resistance as well, a military resistance. So that's the regional front. And then globally, Israel this is already lost. Similar to how the United States has already lost this military campaign with Russia at the global level. It has become more isolated. Russia has become less isolated. The same is happening here. Israel is becoming more and more of a pariah state. Countries around the world just cannot stomach what is happening. The United States consistently vetoes these humanitarian ceasefire agreements, permanent ceasefire agreements at the United Nations Security Council. You have Russia and China consistently hosting the Palestinian resistance, the Palestinian representatives of Hamas, of the various groups, to try to come to some kind of agreement about, what government will actually run an independent Palestine. And so, there is very little appetite in the world for what Israel is doing, and that is really where the future of this conflict is going to reside. It's going to reside in the fact that Israel, as it is constituted right now, and in my opinion, it was always, this whole right to exist narrative. It never, for me, it's like, well, does any settler colony really have the right to exist? Does in any historical example from South Africa to Algeria, did we say that the French had the right to just sit there and, run Algeria, or, the Dutch, British, whatever they are, the Afrikaners, whatever, the apartheid settlers, they had a right, Rhodesia, did the colonialists in so-called Rhodesia, now Zimbabwe, did they have the right to exist? No, they didn't have the right. It doesn't mean you wipe them off the map, but it means they don't have the right to have a state that, colonizes and oppresses people who are indigenous to that land. So in any event, this is where this is going. Israel's overall situation is the worst, in my opinion, that it's ever been. That is where the hope is. I think that's where the enthusiasm should be. But unfortunately, it comes, and this is what's hard for a lot of people to swallow, it comes at a great cost, great sacrifice. I mean, for me, I think every single day, the sacrifice of the Palestinian people is so great. It's probably one of the greatest human sacrifices for a cause that anyone can cite, maybe in all of human history. I mean, maybe that's an exaggeration, but at the same time, it's up there. No matter what sacrifice, no matter what cause we're talking about, no matter what liberation war, this particular moment in Gaza is an example of the Palestinian people's immense sacrifice. Not for us. I mean, for us, it is in part for us, because if Palestine is free, we are all free. But really, it's a sacrifice for their cause, which is why the world has maneuvered, the real world, the multipolar world, the axis of resistance, these forces have maneuvered in a way that is always thinking about, well, how do we preserve and protect this cause while supporting it? Because, you know, Iran, I'm sure Iran's political leadership is having this conversation every day. How do we step up support without igniting a broader war, which would just accelerate the slaughter, which may be unfavorable to a protracted struggle like the one we're seeing now? I think that these are the conversations that are happening. A lot of people are very cynical and say, oh, well, no one's doing enough for Palestine. But I actually don't think that's the case. I actually believe that there are so many forces out there, from all the way at the top of the multipolar world, like China and Russia, to the very smallest resistance forces in Syria and Iraq and these places, that are thinking every day, well, how do we step up our level of support without causing immense damage to the cause? Because I say this about every single flashpoint when it comes to empire, is there's only one side that you cannot trust. There's only one side that has no restraint, that has no regard for human life, and that only sees its very narrow interests for profit, for dominance, for hegemony as the priority, and that's the U.S. empire side. And so that is what I believe the entire resistance everywhere, including in the axis of resistance, is thinking about all the time. And it's something that I think demonstrates where there is a lot of hope amid a lot of despair, a lot of challenges, a lot of suffering that's unfortunately going to continue for quite some time, because this is a protracted struggle. This is one, if we're hearing Israel talking about this being years, maybe a decade, that should be seen as in keeping with Israel's overall goal that dates back decades and decades. But the resistance itself, because it is fighting a particular kind of war, because it has to do so based on resources, it's more of a guerrilla war, it's more of a resistance war. That means we are going to see this struggle last for probably quite a while. But I do believe that the overall trajectory is toward Israel's ultimate. It's toward its ultimate demise. I just don't see any way that Israel comes out of this looking like it did just 7-8 months ago, looking like that it was just a given. It's just a given. You know, the settlements, blah, blah, blah. People talking about, oh, Israel does these unjust things in Gaza, the siege, the settlements in the West Bank. No, that's over. Now there's this entire cause for Palestine that the entire world is thinking about all of the time. And the overall trajectory in the world is to support that cause. And it comes at the expense of Israel, and rightfully so.
Danny Haiphong. Danny, thank you so much for joining me. Oh, anything else coming up besides, I know you're going back to China, but anything else coming up for your channel?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I am, I'm going to be streaming probably next week. I'm still trying to confirm guests. Perhaps Richard Wolff, Mark Sloboda, I think, is coming on late next week, a week from today, I believe. And then I'm going to have this gentleman, Colonel Lawrence Wilkerson, on, who I've followed for a while, who did a lot of interesting work on, he spoke about Xinjiang years ago, talking about Afghanistan. He actually served under Colin Powell, but became a huge whistleblower on wars. So I'll have him on the day before that, Thursday. But you can just follow me, Danny Haiphong, the channel, and you'll get those notifications if you subscribe and hit the notifications bell, maybe. But you can find all the places to find me there on that channel. So thank you.
All right, Danny, thank you so much.
Thank Thank you. Thanks, Sabby.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
All right, guys, that was Danny Haiphong. You can learn a lot from that conversation. So definitely make sure, if you're not already doing so, to follow Danny on his channel. It's his name, Danny Haiphong, especially for those of you that are interested in geopolitics, because that's primarily what he focuses on. So definitely make sure you check him out over there.